Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Is this working? Hello, everyone. Welcome or welcome back. Welcome to Vietnam. Welcome back to Vietnam. We're our second of our 5 lecture series about American Jewish politics. This week, our topic is, I would say, my semi-cryptic or mysterious topic, the quiet conservatism of American Jews. So we're gonna talk about 2 things this evening. First, we're gonna talk about the conservative political tendencies of American Jews. I think that's the most obvious part. But I'm also going to explain to you the quiet part. Let me get to that in just a second. Before we begin, though, I want to reiterate a couple of things, really a couple of things from last week. If you were not here last week, that's okay. Last week was the Jewish response to slavery and the Jewish part of the debate over slavery. And I want to mention one more thing about that, that being that the issue of slavery, this is something that we're going to come back to, not specifically slavery, but the 2 dimensions associated with the issue of slavery. One was a political dimension. In other words, there was a political debate or political part of the debate over slavery. The other was a moral debate. The moral debate was simply the question, I think that's the more well-known part of that debate. The moral debate was, is slavery something acceptable? Or is it so horrific that it needs to disappear? And obviously the resolution, that part of the debate was resolved, though with some difficulty. But the political part of the debate came down to who gets to decide whether or not slavery is something acceptable. The individual, the state, the federal government. And That was a part of the debate. The moral part of the debate over slavery was resolved. Now, there were many Southerners in particular who, in order for it to be resolved, they had to be forced to make the moral decision to give up slavery. That's what the Civil War was about. But slavery as an institution, at least from a moral point of view, was done after the Civil War. But the political part, the question of the struggle between the federal government and the state and the individual, that aspect of the debate lived on. In some ways, it continues on, because in response to the outcome of the Civil War, you had that contest between state government and federal government, not over the question of slavery specifically, but of what it means for African Americans to be full citizens. It was another century after the Civil War where the political status of African Americans was still in doubt. Which is why a century after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Act was necessary. What I'm pointing out is that this debate that had both a moral and a political component to it, the moral part was more resolved than the political part. The political question, the power of the federal government versus the state and the individual, that continued to percolate and continued to simmer. And in that tension between the rights of the individual and the state and the government, that was a debate that Jews continued to weigh in on, well, all the way through the civil rights movement in the 1960s, as we'll see in the subsequent lecture, and in some ways all the way up to the present. I've just also mentioned that slavery was not the only issue that had both this moral and political component. There are issues we are debating right now have that same duality. I think the most obvious example is the debate over abortion. There's a moral issue where there's a disagreement. Some people think that abortion in itself is something that should be disallowed on moral or theological grounds. On the other hand, there's a political issue, the same kind of political issue with slavery. Who gets to decide whether or not it's acceptable? And that's the element of the debate, is the right to choose. But these are two components of the debate, the moral and the political. When they're both in play, whether it's slavery or abortion, it makes for a very difficult and messy debate. I just wanted to make that distinction because for American Jews, when they immerse themselves in these debates, they're immersing not only in the political, but also in the moral, and that gets complicated. So the Jewish view of slavery from a moral point of view, in other words, what does the Bible say about slavery? That was part of the debate. The Jewish view of slavery was also animated by the Jewish belief in, well, for some Jews, especially in the South, the primacy of states' rights. For other Jews, the power of the federal government. So Jews also divided along that line as well. The other thing I wanted to reiterate from last week is, which will be very important for us this week, is what we mean by when we say conservative in terms of politics. Now, I briefly defined it last week. I want to reiterate it. If you weren't here, I want you to hear it. And if you were, don't worry. There's nothing wrong with hearing this twice. Because when we talk about conservative politics, as I briefly mentioned last week, that not everyone understands it properly. Today, conservative as a political category is often misunderstood, it is misused. I would say sometimes it is abused almost. It's abused sometimes because the nature of conservative politics oftentimes is equated with the notion is the more further to the right you are, the more conservative you are. And that is true to a point. Right of center is certainly conservative, but to be conservative means to be anti-radical. So if you get far enough to the right, you cease to be conservative. You become something else. And today, the way we use the relatively loose way we use the term conservative is we're blurring the line between conservative on the one hand and reactionary on the other. Reactionary, that's true. The more right you go, the more you are opposed to any kind of change. That's not necessarily conservative, but that is always reactionary. To be reactionary means you see any change in the status quo as automatically and inherently negative, and you fight against it. Conservative does not mean anti-change. Conservative means more. It's more an approach to the pace of change and the way in which a change is undertaken. But rarely have we had classic conservative thinkers who have said any and all change is unacceptable. The original political conservative, or maybe the one who really coined the term, was a late 18th century English thinker named Sir Edmund Burke, who was a severe critic of the French Revolution. He felt those changes and the elimination of hereditary privilege and all the things of the French Revolution, he said they were wrong, but he didn't reject all the changes that came associated with that one change. He was not against change. He actually believed that progress was something inherent to society. Things just need to change relatively slowly and not abruptly. So Sir Edmund Burke was conservative but not reactionary. Just to make sure it's crystal clear, let me venture into more dangerous territory and give you a couple of examples to differentiate conservative from reactionary. It'll be important to be instructive. The Republican Party today is the more conservative party. Now, we saw last time during the slavery debate, the Republican Party was not the more conservative party. Republican and Democrat have flip-flopped a few times, but today there are many Republicans who are classically conservative. If you want to really understand, conservative is Senator Mitt Romney, the late Senator John McCain, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, other than his attitude towards communism. And that helps us explain, for example, why a conservative political thinker like Richard Nixon, he was the first to suggest national health care. He was the first to suggest Medicare for all. It makes sense. It makes sense if you see him as, if you understand what conservative means. Now, if he were reactionary, he would have rejected that out of hand. So if Nixon, Reagan, Romney, McCain, they're conservative. Reactionary are those who reject any change. And today, our classic reactionary politician, the most visible figure is, you know who I'm going to say, Senator Mitch McConnell, who spent almost a decade simply saying, I am going to oppose every single change. And simply, that is reactionary, and that is an unconservative way to act. Now, he is an example of someone who hides under the guise or under the cloak of conservatism, but he's way out of sync. I think in some ways he's anomalous. He just happens to be very visible. He's in a position of great influence, but reactionary, not conservative. Now, I mention all of this to make the point that while conservatism and a conservative political outlook has consistently been part of the political attitude of American Jews for several centuries, as we shall see, it is rare, if not unheard of, for Jews to become reactionary. Jews, more than anything else, have tended to be moderate and centrist. Remember, last week we defined conservatism as a right-of-center outlook. Conservatives are moderate and centrist on the right side, but they are more centrist. For conservative, the real adversary is radical and extreme, and Jews have avoided radical positions for the most part. The last 2 years have been a bit of an exception, but not that big of one. But that's the larger trend. So, with that in mind, let's dive into this question, the quiet conservatism of American Jews. So first, let me say that in the 20th century, well, for the last century or a little bit more, American Jews were overwhelmingly liberal and progressive. And so the political profile of American Jews for the last century has been largely progressive. And not this evening, but the next 2 weeks, we'll take a good close look at why that was, or why that has been. But prior to a century ago, I would say prior to the First World War, certainly prior to the arrival of Eastern European immigrants beginning in the 1880s, prior to that point, certainly, but still prior to the First World War, American Jewry was overwhelmingly conservative, as long as we understand conservative not to be the same thing as reactionary. To understand conservatism in its classic sense, until the 20th century, American Jewry was overwhelmingly conservative. What do I mean by the quiet conservatism. There's one more term I have to define, and then we can look at some specific examples. And that is a concept called, or a political approach called, quietism. It's a great term. Quietism refers to not only an outlook, but more a strategy or a tactic. When we say that someone is politically quietistic, which is an actual political science term, we're saying that the way that this individual or this group, in this case American Jews, the way they advocate for what they believe is, as the term denotes, quietly. Meaning that quietism denotes the absence of political parties, the absence of mass public protest or public protest of any kind. Quietism is a way of describing the behind closed doors way of diplomacy. And until the First World War, not only were American Jews largely conservative, American Jews are also quietistic as well. Let me be clear here. To be quietistic, or to have this, or to embrace quietism does not mean to be passive. It doesn't mean to be weak or impotent. Just because you're not advocating publicly as in a mass form doesn't mean you're being passive. In fact, as we shall see, American Jews were anything but passive. They were quietistic, but they were not passive. And we see this quietism woven into the fabric of American Jewish life almost from the very moment that American Jews, or that Jews arrived in North America. It goes all the way back to the beginnings of Jewish life in North America. Now, the first Jews arrived in North America, as you may know, 1654. 1654, a group of 23 Jews arrived in New York Harbor from Recife, Brazil. Long story short, they had been allowed to live in Brazil because northeastern Brazil had been conquered by the Dutch from the Portuguese. And the Portuguese didn't allow Jews in. The Dutch did. There was a small little settlement of Jews in Recife, but then the Portuguese reconquered that part of Brazil in 1654, and the Jews were expelled. And they were forced to find haven elsewhere. And these were the Jews who arrived in, well, it wasn't even New York yet, it was New Amsterdam. It was a small Jewish community. Now, the governor of New Amsterdam was a Dutch individual, Dutch noble, whose name was Peter Stuyvesant. Same guy who bought New Amsterdam from the native tribes there. And Stuyvesant was he was a pious Christian. He didn't want any Jews. And so, look at your handout. In September of 1654, he wrote a letter to the Amsterdam Chamber of the Dutch West India Company. Now, chamber here means like Chamber of Commerce. It's not an actual room, like treasury of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company was in some ways, it was a privately owned company that really oversaw and funded Dutch settlements in the New World, in North and South America. That community in Recife, Brazil, had been funded and had been supported by the Dutch West India Company, and the other Dutch settlements, colonies in the Western Hemisphere were part of the Dutch West India Company. So Curaçao, and Suriname, and New Amsterdam as well. So this is Peter Stuyvesant, who's governing New Amsterdam, not only on behalf of the Dutch government, a state institution, but also on behalf of the Dutch West India Company, a private institution. So this is what he writes, text number 1. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning that they, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, as also to the people having the most affection for you, the deaconry also fearing that owing to their present indigence, they might become a charge in the coming winter, we have, for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place, newly developing place in the land in general, deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart. Now, you have to give it to the Dutch. That is the most polite edict of expulsion. The Jews, and no one was ever that polite in expelling the Jews. It's so nice. Even now, Netherlands, this is the nicest. Praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves as also for the general community of your worships, that the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, be not allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony to the detraction of your worships and the dissatisfaction of your worships' most affectionate subjects. He expelled them from New Amsterdam, right? But the story didn't end there, because several months later, it took time for his expulsion edict to reach the Netherlands, and it took time for an answer. In fact, he got an answer from his petition in April 1655, right? Now, before I read you this answer, I'll hand you one little important piece of information. The Dutch West India Company was located in Amsterdam, not New Amsterdam, Old Amsterdam, which was just called Amsterdam. And there were prominent Jewish merchants who lived in Amsterdam. This was in the mid 17th century the most prominent and most prosperous Jewish community in Europe. There were prominent Jews who were part of the board of the Dutch West India Company. So with that in mind, look at text number 2. The reply states, "We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territories should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation, for we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear," meaning some kind of religious problem or religious infection or something, but also a problem of Jewish poverty. But after having further weighed and considered the matter, we observe that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others in the taking of Brazil. These prominent Jews supported the Dutch war effort, and also because a large amount of capital, which they still have invested in the shares of this company. There are prominent Jewish stockholders in the Dutch West India Company. Therefore, after many deliberations, we have finally decided to resolve to apostille upon a certain position, like it's rule on a position, take a position, presented by said Portuguese Jews. Portuguese is the name of what they called Dutch Jews because many of them, their ancestors had come from Portugal. They were conversos who had returned to Judaism. It's another story. But these Portuguese Jews, meaning Jews in Amsterdam, that these people may travel and trade to and in New Netherlands and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company and the community, but be supported by their own nation. You will now govern yourself accordingly. In other words, they said two things. This expulsion edict is not happening because our Jewish investors were not happy about it. And the other thing is, provided that the Jews as a community, they commit to take care of their own poor. As long as they do not become an economic drain on the economy, which they never did, and they certainly weren't in Amsterdam, they're allowed to stay. Now, the reason I cite this as an example of quietism is there was, if these prominent Jews in Amsterdam had made some kind of public stink, organized a protest, even gone to the government, but they did none of those things. All that happened was a private meeting behind closed doors in which they said, we assume something along the lines of, if you allow this expulsion to take place, we're pulling our funding from the Dutch West India Company, you're going bankrupt. Presumably, some version of that conversation took place, and the edict was reversed or annulled. And so here we have an example where this quietistic political strategy, though quiet, was anything but passive, and it was powerfully effective. Now, that strategy would define the political tactics of Jews in America really into the beginning of the 20th century. Next week and the week after, we'll see the beginnings of the rise of more public mass Jewish politics. But through the end of the 19th century, certainly, this is how Jews did political business, so to speak. Now, we have another instance that happened a couple centuries later, which illustrates the same kind of point. I mean, that one you might say, oh, that was way at the beginning, maybe that was more European. We have another example that took place right in the heart of the American Jewish story, right in the heart of the American story. This is something which took place during the Civil War. Now, the Civil War, really until the end of 1862, was not going very well for the Union. The Confederacy was doing very well. They had better generals. They were winning battles. It was difficult for the Union to win. The only Union general who was having any kind of real success was the general who was in charge of the troops out west. West, in this context, means Midwest. This was Ulysses S. Grant. He was in charge of Union forces in the province of Tennessee area, and he was doing very well. Now Grant, you should know, as an individual, I would say he was not a great lover of human beings. He was racist, he was sexist, he was misogynist, and yes, he was anti-Semitic. But he wasn't just anti-Semitic. It's as blatant as his anti-Semitism was, he just didn't like anybody. You see, he was a gruff and rough person. Mind you, later when he became president, he had a change of heart about Jews. We'll get to that as well. But during the Civil War in 1862, he was general in a border province between the North and the South. He was hearing frequent reports about smuggling, about smugglers who were smuggling weapons and other supplies across the border into the Confederacy and helping the armies who were fighting against Grant's soldiers. He also heard, part of this rumor was, many or most of these smugglers were Jews, were local Jewish merchants who were just trying to make a buck out of the war. And in response to that situation, he wrote a letter to the Assistant Secretary of War in December of 1862. This is text number 3. I have long since believed that in spite of all the vigilance that can be infused into post commanders, that the specie regulations of the Treasury Department, specie means money or wealth, which means the movement of wealth regulations of the Treasury Department have been violated, and that mostly by Jews and other unprincipled traders. So well satisfied of this have I been at this that I instructed the commanding officer of Columbus, Kentucky, to refuse all permits to Jews to come south, and frequently have had them expelled from the Department of Tennessee. But they come in with their carpet sacks in spite of all that can be done to prevent it. The Jews seem to be a privileged class that can travel anywhere. They will land at any woodyard or landing on the river and make their way through the country. If not permitted to buy cotton themselves, they will act as agents for someone else who will be at a military post with a treasury permit to receive cotton and pay for it in treasury notes, which the Jews will buy up at an agreed rate, paying gold. There is but one way I know to reach this case. They are a curse to the army, might be expelled. In other words, the only way to deal with the problem of smuggling is to expel all the Jews from the Department of Tennessee. Yes, an expulsion edict in the United States during the Civil War. Now, partly it was motivated by Grant's disdain for Jews. He bought into the stereotype that all capable merchants are Jewish. One of these moments where what seems like a positive appraisal of Jews, all Jews are good at business, actually turned out to be something negative and worked to their disadvantage. And so, look at text number 4. He issued in the same day, along with this letter, General Order number 11, which said, the Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders are hereby expelled from the Department of Tennessee within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. Post commanders will see to it that all of this class of people be furnished passes and required to leave, and anyone returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until an opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners unless furnished with permit from headquarters. No passes will be given. In other words, Jews out. This is an expulsion edict. And the reasons are, well, they're military reasons and they're commercial reasons. These Jews are breaking the law, they're undermining the war effort, and they need to go. And this is what Grant wanted to do. Now, this expulsion edict never went into effect because, well, within a couple of weeks, basically the time it took for a telegram to be sent from the Tennessee area to Washington, D.C., for Lincoln to have for the news to make its way up the hierarchy for Lincoln and back, this decree was annulled. Now, the person who was instrumental in responding to Grant was a leading community member, a leading Jew in this area, whose name was Cesar Cascal. Now, he was a prominent Jewish communal leader and merchant. He was well connected. He also he knew personally many leading state officials, but also he knew the Secretary of War. And so he basically sent a telegram to one of his friends in Washington, D.C., who conveyed the news and the complaint that was that was lodged on behalf of Jews by this prominent, loyal citizen and supporter, a patriot, Caesar Catskill. Eventually, it got to President Lincoln, and on January 3rd, 1863, this is text number 5, Grant basically got a response from General Henry Wager Halleck, who was General-in-Chief. Now, General-in-Chief, today we would call that person the Joint Chief of Staff. So Grant, he was not Commander-in-Chief of the armies yet. He was not the high general, but even so, this is the person who is directly under Lincoln, or maybe directly under the Secretary of War. This is what they said. Text number 5. A paper purporting to be General Order Number 11, issued by you December 17, has been presented here. By all terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been issued, it will be immediately revoked. So basically, they're not even saying we're revoking the order. They're basically saying to Grant, we're going to pretend that this order never even took place. You can read between the lines. You can hear them saying to Grant, are you out of your mind? What is wrong with you? General, you're an excellent general, but please don't try to make policy decisions. And the general order never went into effect. But the mechanism here, another example of quietistic politics, where Jews used their political connections. They made these connections made their way to Washington, to the Secretary of War, to President Lincoln, who instantly, basically just didn't even have to revoke the order. They basically negated its existence, and this eviction edict never went into place. Now that's the quiet dimension of the quiet conservatism. But that's how Jews, in terms of their political strategy, would continue to behave until the beginning of the 20th century. That approach to politics, as we shall see presently, really came to a head, or reached a high point, in the creation at the beginning of the 20th century of a Jewish organization called the American Jewish Committee. We'll get to that in a minute. But the outlook and the strategy of the American Jewish Committee is going to draw on the same strategy that was used by Jews to deal with Grant, that was used by Jews to deal with Peter Stuyvesant as well. That was the strategy. The conservatism was the outlook. So you have the outlook and the strategy, and they work very well together. Now, one of the reasons that both this outlook and this strategy worked very well for American Jews through the end of the 19th century was, first of all, and really until the 20th century, American Jewry was not very well organized. There were individual communities, and some of these individual communities, as communities, were organized pretty well. But there was almost nothing in the way of an umbrella national Jewish organization, really till close to the end of the 19th century. There were things that were sort of, intercommunal. There was the Reform movement, which was very successful. But even the Central College of American Reform Rabbis didn't really have the authority to coordinate between communities. There was B'nai B'rith, founded in the 1850s, which was an organization that spanned the United States with chapters everywhere. But the individual chapters were much more decisive or much more influential in terms of deciding what they did or didn't want to do. The national B'nai B'rith was less effective. Although B'nai B'rith is an interesting example, because during moments of crisis, an organization, a loosely organized or loosely federated organization like B'nai B'rith could come together and act in a concerted way to make change. And here we have a very interesting example of another example of Jews using this quietistic strategy, exerting influence on the President of the United States, in this case, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant was president from 1868 to 1872. Now, when Grant was president, this is a period of time where the war was over, the Reconstruction had begun, normal life was beginning to return, and for American Jews, the situation was stabilizing. General Order 11 had been largely forgotten. But this is the point when American Jews began to not only become aware of, the plight of Jews in Europe, but begin to try to act on behalf of adversity facing Jews in Europe. At the end of the 1860s, the Jews in Europe, and the beginning of the 1870s, the Jews in Europe who were having the biggest problem with anti-Semitism and persecution were not yet the Jews of Russia. That would happen in the 1880s, but the Jews of Romania. Now, Romania in the late 1860s was in transition from being a territory, part of the Ottoman Empire, to becoming an independent state. Romania became independent by the Congress of Berlin in 1878. But it was becoming independent. There was a lot of internal turmoil. Romania also had a large Jewish community. It was adjacent to Russian Jewry. And Romanian Jews were having a lot of problems. And American Jews, at the end of the 1860s, they began to lobby quietly, diplomatically, on behalf of Romanian Jews. Now, the individual who led that quiet diplomatic campaign on behalf of Romanian Jews was a Jew who was from Cleveland, Ohio, whose name was Benjamin F. Paisado. Now, the F here, it stands for Franklin. His name was Benjamin Franklin Paisado. Yes, he was named for Benjamin Franklin. His parents had been immigrants from Central Europe. He had grown up as a child in New York. Eventually, they moved to Cleveland. He was the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and he eventually became one of the prominent Jews of the Jewish community of Cleveland, which was an important Midwestern community. And he became not only one of the local leaders of B'nai B'rith, but the closest thing that B'nai B'rith had in the 1860s to a national figure. And so he didn't just approach President Grant as an individual. He approached President Grant on behalf of B'nai B'rith, or the chapters of B'nai B'rith, and asked President Grant to somehow intervene on behalf of, or exercise some kind of diplomatic leverage on behalf of Romanian Jews. And this was something that started at the end of the 1860s. It would go on for several years. And eventually, the leaders of European Jewish communities joined in, most notably the heads of the English Board of Deputies, who was Moses Montefiore, prominent French Jews, even prominent Russian Jews, and what came to fruition in 1878, when Romania became an independent country, is that the rights of its religious minorities, including Jews, were guaranteed by the international agreement recognizing Romanian independence. But part of that diplomatic initiative was contributed to by American Jews. But this is still not that different from what we've seen. This is backdoor diplomacy, backdoor negotiation by prominent, influential, well-connected American Jews. And I would say that this in and of itself was not something unique or novel to American Jewry. This was a part of Jewish political life through much of the Middle Ages, maybe even going back to antiquity. This is for centuries. This is how Jews advocated for themselves in this quiet, conservative sort of way, as opposed to sort of any kind of public radical sort of way. In fact, for most European Jewish communities, in addition to their regular array of communal leaders, there was an individual who's known, an appointed official of the Jewish community. The Jews would choose someone who was known as the Shtadlan. Now, Shtadlan is a Hebrew word. It comes from a Hebrew word which means, the Hebrew word like ishtadel, which can mean to try or to put an effort, but in this context, it also means to intercede. So the Shtadlan was the individual, a member of the Jewish community, who would intercede on behalf of the Jewish community with the state authorities. And you typically, as you would imagine, it was someone who was wealthy, it was someone who was well-connected. You had to be educated and literate because you had to be able to write or speak in the languages of government. But every Jewish community had one. And eventually the term Shtadlanut was coined in Europe to describe the strategy of using the Shtadlan. And we see this is the same thing. This is an example of Shtadlanut. So American Jews, who in many ways were trying to leave their European heritage behind, start fresh in America, they never called it Shtadlanut in America. They never called it Stadtland, but that's what it was. Someone like Benjamin Pizarro, he was the Stadtland of American Jews. He was acting. He wasn't the officially appointed intercessor. That, in effect, is what he was doing. Now, toward the end of the 19th century, as American Jewry grows larger and becomes more well organized, its political life becomes more complex as well. Let me pause here and make sure it's clear that so far we've talked about this quiet approach, pragmatic approach. What do we mean? Why are we saying that? Why are we describing American Jews as conservative? Now, in the 19th century, your typical conservative political values, which American Jews overwhelmingly embraced, first were limited government, and especially limited government interference in the life of the individual. And American Jews were not alone in loving that idea. Remember, many Jews had come from Europe where the government was intervening in their lives. In Europe, when Jews were oftentimes were still second-class citizens, the fact that Jews faced restrictions, state restrictions on residence and occupation and education, these were examples of the government impeding their ability to do what they want, become successful, become happy. In America, there were no such restrictions, and Jews associated this with limited government interference, like other conservatives. Remember, here I mean centrists. Jews liked the fact that the state, its role was limited. And like other conservatives, the role of the state, insofar as it ever got bigger, it was only in time of emergency. If there was a war, then the state could play a greater role in the military, in the economy. But in normal times, in peace times, the state was best unseen. Like someone like John Locke said, that government is best, which governs least. Most Jews embrace that idea. They liked that idea. Prompting the chief rabbi of Great Britain, who was Joseph Hertz. He's the one who edited the Hertz Chumash. He also wrote a Sigur, and which was published a bit later. And even in the 20th century, here he's referring not only to American Jews, but I guess we would say Anglo-American Jewry. In his estimation, what does he say? Jews are by nature conservative. Loyalty to the state is ingrained in the Jewish character. In all those countries in which persecution has not embittered their life, Jews are no more radical than the non-Jewish members of the social class to which they belong. Now, what Hertz is making a connection between here is that Jews living in a situation which is stable, which is not an adversarial situation, did not have recourse or need to resort to radical tactics. And historically, it bears out, certainly in Europe, during times of revolution. When revolutionaries tried to make changes, there would be some Jews who participated in the revolution, particularly if one of the aims of the revolution was Jewish emancipation. But during normal times, Jews were content to support the state, to be loyal citizens, to believe in the rule of law, to believe in that the system would continue gradually to progress, to improve the lives of the individuals. That was the Jewish outlook. And that, in many ways, was really the pervading mentality of the vast majority of American Jews. Now, toward the end of the 19th century, really in some ways, 1880 is a kind of turn. By 1880, there were about 250,000 Jews in America, most of whom had come to America during the preceding 40 or 50 years from Central Europe, countries like Germany and Hungary and Austria, what is today the Czech Republic. Central European Jews, most of whom had fled either some kind of political persecution, some kind of economic restrictions. They came to America for a better life, and for the most part, they found a better life. Your typical story of American Jews who were living in America by the 1880s, who had come from Central Europe, most of who had come were poor, and when they started out as peddlers, a few got rich, like Levi Strauss. He invented a kind of pants. Macy's, Gimbel's, the big department stores, Neiman Marcus. The typical Jewish story was you come, you peddle, you start out as a peddler, and you become a shopkeeper. Not unlike Great Britain, American Jewry was a Jewry of shopkeepers by the 1880s. Now, shopkeepers is your small business person has tended to want to avoid radical politics. They want stability. They want the state to maintain it or not to interrupt it. They want local society to be stable. And this is what made Jews conservative. Now, another part of this politically conservative Jewish approach stemmed from which in some ways might see from opposite directions. On the one hand, it reflected the degree to which American Jews were becoming American, because American society was also largely politically conservative. It eschewed radicalism in both directions. So on the one hand, Jews being politically conservative reflected their affinity, their immersion in mainstream society. On the other hand, another important element of that conservative outlook is the preserving of traditional values. So even though many of these Jews had become more assimilated, certainly there were very few Jews who were we would call Orthodox Jews, or let's say overly observant Jews. Those Jews would only come much later. But the majority of American Jews either belonged to a Reformed temple, some kind of congregation, or a Jewish organization like the They believed in maintaining and preserving some measure of Jewish identity. So they had a connection. They had both the traditional on the one hand, but also they were immersing themselves in the larger American values on the other. This was American Jewry until 1880. Now that situation began to change after 1880. After 1880, there's a mass influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. We all know that. In fact, many of us are descended from those Jews. Our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. The majority of American Jews today are descended from this massive wave of 2 or 3 million Jews who came from Eastern Europe to America from 1880 to 1914. Now, for the Jews who are already here, for this assimilated, Americanized, probably a better term, Americanized, politically conservative, American Jewish community that really had established itself as very stable by the 1880s. It was a bit jarring for all of these unassimilated, un-Americanized, unacculturated, more traditional, very different looking Jews from Eastern Europe suddenly showing up. And the question came up, well, for the leaders of American Jewry in the 1880s, well, what are we going to do about this? So the central question that faced the American Jewish leaders, or the central political question that American Jews interested themselves or engaged in at the end of the 19th century, was the question of immigration. Now, this question, their interest in immigration, their concern over immigration, it really took place in a number of different ways. It wasn't just sort of one strategy or one response. First and foremost, there was the concern for the plight of Jews in Eastern Europe that had set this immigration movement in motion in the first place. They knew about anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. They knew about the pogroms in Russia in 1881, and the second wave in 1903. They knew about the economic hardships of Russian Jews because of the economic restrictions placed by the Tsar after 1880. They knew about these difficulties, and they wanted to help. Here we have to be clear also. American Jewish leaders, they wanted to help their co-religionists in Eastern Europe for 2 reasons. One of which was very ennobling, I think. The other was a bit more self-serving. The more ennobling reason is, well, these are fellow Jews, but we should use whatever means and influence we have to help them, which is very nice. But there was a self-serving motive as well, that being, if we can alleviate the problem in Eastern Europe, maybe fewer of them will come to America. We can slow down this, let's call it a semi-disturbing wave of Jewish immigration. And so in the 1880s, they began to ask the question, what can we, as the American Jewish community, do to alleviate or improve the situation of Jews in Eastern Europe. And here, Eastern Europe meant primarily the Russian Empire, which at the time included most of what is today Poland, most of what is today Ukraine, all the way down to the Crimea. Most Jews in Europe lived in the Russian Empire, and most Jews coming from Europe, certainly not all, were coming from the Russian Empire. Many Jews were coming from Galicia, which was part of Austria-Hungary, and that was sort of a secondary part of this problem, and Romania as well was still. So they began to ask, what can we Jews do? And really it came down to two things. We've got this strategy, which has proven effective in the past, of quietly lobbying with the powers that be in Washington. And the leaders of the American Jewish community in the 1880s, they began to lobby on behalf of the plight of Russian Jews, on behalf of Russian Jews, with every president from the 1881 on. Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland again, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, what were they lobbying specifically? They wanted the United States to do something that would force, or at least encourage, Russia, the Tsar, to treat Jews better. Now, they weren't asking for an invasion, obviously, that wasn't going to happen. The focal point of a lot of this political lobbying was a treaty. It was a commercial treaty that the United States had signed with Russia in 1832. Basically, this was an agreement that we're going to trade freely without tariffs. It's a free trade agreement signed between the two countries in 1832. Now, when it was signed, the United States was a fairly insignificant trading partner. The United States in 1832 was very small, relatively speaking. Was that significant? By the 1880s, the United States was more populous, was a much larger consumer of products, goods that the Russians wanted to sell, and also an exporter of products that the Russians didn't mind importing, which could be cheaper than if they bought them in London, Paris, or someplace else. So there was some leverage here. So the lobbying began not only with the White House, with the president, but also with members of Congress. They wanted that trade agreement annulled, or at least renegotiated. They tried for several decades. They tried in the back. It never happened. There were larger interests in play. But that doesn't mean that the effort itself was not significant. And several decades of lobbying on behalf of Russian Jews, by the beginning of the 20th century, convinced prominent American Jews, the leaders of American Jewry, that this kind of lobbying would be more effective if it wasn't ad hoc. We'll just sort of meet in Washington one week and do some spur-of-the-moment lobbying. If it was conducted or guided by an official, prominent Jewish organization. And this is the background for the founding of the American Jewish Committee, which was founded in 1906 with the specific purpose of lobbying or acting on behalf of Russian Jews. Now, first, let me make it clear. You have to distinguish the American Jewish Committee from the American Jewish Congress. The American Jewish Congress was founded a decade or two later. The American Jewish Congress was founded on more democratic principles. It's going to have representatives from Jewish communities all over the United States, where the representatives would be elected. It was like a Congress. The American Jewish Committee was not at all democratic. This was an organization in which the wealthiest and most prominent American Jews were invited to join. You weren't elected to the American Jewish Committee. You were invited or appointed, not by any government official, but by prominent Jews themselves. The main organizers of this new Jewish organization were Jacob Schiff, Louis Marshall, and Oscar Strauss. They had a similar story. They were all the children or grandchildren of immigrants from Central Europe. The families had come to America, poor, had made their fortune, had become not only successful and wealthy and well-connected in American society, but also devoted Jewish communal leaders and intensely philanthropic. And it was Louis Marshall. He was the one who defined the parameters and the mission of the American Jewish community. Look at text number 7. This is a letter he wrote to Rabbi Joseph Stultz, who was a prominent rabbi in America at the beginning of the 20th century, in which, really, in many ways, the ideas in this letter became the manifesto of the American Jewish community. What I am trying to avoid more than anything else is the creation of a political organization, one which will be looked upon as indicative of a purpose on the part of the Jews to recognize that they have interests different from those of other American citizens. This is not a political organization. As we'll see, even though they said it wasn't a political organization, it was a political organization which was continuing a political tradition that went all the way back to Stites. I conceive that there can be but two tenable theories on which Jews have the right to organize. First, as a religious body, and secondly, as persons interested in the same philanthropic purpose. Obviously, it will be an absolute impossibility for the Jews of this country to unite as a religious body, having ecclesiastical and disciplinary powers. It would be impossible to afford to such an organization the authority and sanction which are essential to successfully carrying out such a scheme. In other words, the idea of establishing an established Jewish church, so to speak, or a national Jewish organization in America made no sense, mainly because the First Amendment to the Constitution prevented any religious organization of that kind. There were Catholic churches in America, but there was no single authoritative body over American Catholics. There were Protestant churches, but there was no established Protestant church in America. Those things simply, a religious organization can't have that kind of authority over its members unless the members voluntarily accept it. So these churches and synagogues in America acted like voluntary societies. They didn't have the same kind of coercive authority that the Pope had over Catholics, that the Lutheran Church had over Lutherans in Europe. It was a different situation. Beyond that, though, Marshall was aware that there was enough diversity of Jewish practice and belief. There's no way you're getting all these communities and congregations to agree on a single organization. That would be as difficult then as it was now. So organizing on along religious lines was possible. But what about the second line, philanthropy? We can, however, all unite for the purpose of aiding all Jews who are persecuted or who are suffering from discrimination in any part of the world on account of their religious beliefs. And we can, at the same time, unite for the purpose of ameliorating the condition of our brethren in faith who are suffering from the effects of such persecution and discrimination, directly or indirectly. In other words, the American Jewish Committee was founded as a philanthropic organization. Officially, its mandate, its mission was exclusively collecting money, collecting charitable donations, and helping to channel these charitable donations to Jews who were in need elsewhere in the world. That is what its official mission was. But as we all know, oftentimes an organization will move beyond its official mission. And in this case, that's exactly what the American Jewish Committee did. Because almost immediately, yes, they began with the philanthropy right away, and they were very good at it. They sent a lot of money. One of the things this organization spawned was the American Joint Distribution Committee, which has been bringing aid to Jews in need in Europe and other parts of the world for a very, very long time. That was one of its great successes. But quietly, behind the scenes, beyond this official mission, the American Jewish community helped Marshall and Strauss and Schiff and its other prominent, well-connected members to continue this mission of diplomacy, of trying to exert leverage on behalf of Jews being mistreated in other parts of the world. And this, they began until the First World War, this consisted really of more of the same. They were exerting influence to try to help the U.S. government exert influence on the Russian Tsar to try to improve the situation of Jews. Okay, but they were very clear that none of this they were doing was political. What Marshall wrote again in 1912, 6 years after the organization was founded. This is text number 8. We have no political interests which are different from those of our fellow citizens. We would subject ourselves to just criticism if we organized political clubs of our own. There is no such thing as a Jewish Republican or a Jewish Democrat. You're a Republican or you're a Democrat. It just happens to be those two things in Marshall's mind and the mind of the participants or the members of the American Jewish Committee, at least officially, were entirely separate. But that aside, that lovely statement aside, what they were doing, they were an advocacy organization. In some ways, the American Jewish Committee was the original Jewish lobby. Now, they were lobbying initially on behalf of Russian Jews, but their aims began to get a little bit more complicated during the war. During the First World War, really beginning in 1916 and 1917, there was a change in the American attitude toward immigration. Until 1914, the prevailing American attitude toward organization, both by ordinary Americans and by American government, was open borders. One of the reasons why, when 3 million Jews came to America between 1881 and 1914, that was part of a much larger wave of 20 million people who came to America. This was seen as a cheap labor force. We need to build the country, to populate the cities. That they were seen as necessary and beneficial. And not only was immigration encouraged, open, unrestricted immigration was encouraged. And in many ways, the United States is still reaping the fruits of that unrestricted immigration. That sounded like a little political statement. Okay, yeah, so be it. It was, definitely. By the way, yes, in case you had any doubts, yes. But during the war, the attitude began to change. There was this notion that immigration also had a downside. Now, this attitude, this change in attitude, had really very little to do with the immigrants themselves. The individuals and members of Congress who began to oppose immigration, their thinking was, it's because of this, the connection between the United States and Europe has become too strong, and that's what's dragged the United States into a costly European war. There were a lot of American soldiers who were killed. There were Americans who said, why are we even fighting? And this is none of our business. Now, most other Americans said, well, we have to because since the time of Theodore Roosevelt, the United States was the defender of democracy, the defender of right. There were reasons to be there. But we have, in other words, during the First World War, the emergence of an anti-immigrant xenophobia, part of a mentality of isolation. Yes, it is eerily similar to what is happening right now. But 100 years ago, it was a different situation or different roots, but the same outcome. And so there was a bill that came before Congress in 1917. Now, this wasn't specifically an anti-immigration bill. This was a bill that was going to place a literacy test as a prerequisite to immigrating to the United States. In other words, this bill would say anyone who comes to Ellis Island, anyone who arrives in Ellis Island, in order to be accepted, you have to demonstrate that you can speak English, speak and read English. This would disqualify most immigrants. I wouldn't disqualify all immigrants. This is a way to say, if you're immigrating from Great Britain, you can still come. If you're immigrating from the Netherlands, where English was a second first language, definitely can come. Why not? Scandinavian countries as well. But if you're coming from Russia, where very few people speak very good English, speak very much English, you're not allowed anymore. So this wasn't, theoretically, this wasn't going to be specifically targeting certain immigrants, but it definitely was. Moreover, it was well known that the majority of immigrants coming from Russia, if not the majority, at least a large plurality, were Jews. This is a way to restrict Jewish immigration. And the American Jewish Committee, though not a political organization, began to lobby members of Congress against adding that to the regulations about immigration. They were lobbying against this restriction on immigration. And when the war ended, this fervor, this anti-immigrant fervor, began to ratchet itself up even more. Now, they were very much aware of it. They were very much concerned about it. And they were concerned not only in terms of a state policy, but also in terms of what this would do to the image of American Jews. Remember, one of the goals is for American Jews not to be overly conspicuous as an element of the United States. They wanted Jews to become American. Now, one of the first ways to help to prevent this the arrival of a mass of Jews in the United States from becoming overly conspicuous, overly prominent, was to try to distribute Jews or settle Jews evenly across the United States. Now, there was reason to believe this was possible because the previous wave of immigration, the immigrants who had come from Central Europe during previous generations, they had moved across the United States. That wave of 250,000 Jews from Central Europe, some of them settled in East Coast cities, but most of them moved west with the westward movement. Most were the ones who founded Jewish communities in the Midwest, including our own. One of the reasons why the Hebrew Union College was the Reformed Seminary was in Cincinnati and not in New York was because the expectation in the 1860s is that Jews would be evenly distributed, from sea to shining sea, manifest destiny, just like everyone else, and it was really happening. But the wave that came after 1880, the Eastern European immigrants, the westward movement was more or less over. This was the age of industrialization, where most immigrants, Jews and otherwise, were settling in industrial cities, above all eastern seaboard cities, and above all in New York City, the ultimate industrial city. And so there was nothing comparable to the Lower East Side in the previous wave. But by 1900, there were 600,000 Jews living on the east side of southern Manhattan, which, by the way, wasn't even called the Lower East Side until it was full of Jews. It became a coded way of saying where all the Jewish immigrants live. But this is exactly what the American Jewish Committee wanted not to happen. And so Jacob Schiff, really its leading member, he came up with an idea known as the Galveston Project. He said the reason all the Jews are settling in New York is because they're all coming to New York Harbor, to Ellis Island. If we had a second port of entry far away from where Jews would be diverted, it wouldn't be as conspicuous. And so he funded a second port of entry in Galveston, Texas. Look what he wrote to the Galveston Committee in 1914. This is text number 9. Now that the Galveston Committee has closed its work, I want to express to the members of my committee my deep appreciation of the cooperation and valuable advice I have received from you as my colleagues on the committee in an effort on our part to solve an important problem of great and lasting value both to the immigrants as well as to our own country. I believe in this. I believe we have a right to feel that we have in a measure succeeded, far aside from the fact that we have settled almost 10,000 immigrants in the hinterland of the United States, every one of whom is likely to form more or less a center of attraction for others to follow. We have acquired experience, which is certain to be most useful in further efforts. In other words, we have diverted some immigrants, and maybe we can divert more. Ultimately, the Galveston Project didn't amount to very much, although there are many Jewish communities along the Mississippi, for example, that were founded by Jews from Eastern Europe who arrived in Galveston because of the Galveston Project. But it reflects Schiff's mentality. There's a mentality of self-consciousness here. He's looking for a nice, subtle, quiet, behind-the-scenes way of making sure that all the Jews don't come to New York. Yes, all the Jews did go to New York, but they continued to lobby. Now, here is another example. Here is an example where the lobbying of the American Jewish community, its limits were exposed by whether or not its aims were in sync with larger American aims. When it came to General Grant or Peter Stuyvesant, and when they were lobbying for, was basically in tune with what most America, well, really, the spirit of America, welcoming. It worked. In this case, by the early 1920s, anti-immigrant xenophobia was surging in the United States, and for all its commendable efforts, the American Jewish Committee was not able to prevent the Congress from passing the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, which effectively was an anti-Jewish immigration bill. But they had one other strategy for dealing with what they called the problem or the issue or the concern over immigrants, having failed to stem the tide of immigration until the 1920s, by which point there were already so many Jews there. The second part of the strategy, they took their philanthropic aim and channeled it. Their goal became to make as many of these immigrants from Eastern Europe as Americanized as quickly as possible. The best way, yes, all these Jews arrived while immigration was permitted. All these Jews arrived. They're here. Most of them are in New York City. What can we do to make them less conspicuous? Let's make them more American. And they founded programs, particularly education programs. The most prominent of which in New York City was called Educational Alliance. It was basically night school for immigrants, where immigrant would work all day. You'd work in the sweatshop, but you could get free lessons in English, in civics. You could learn to speak English, and you could prepare for the citizenship test as quickly as possible. So the American Jewish Committee said, our goal here is, we act in an inconspicuous way. We want the Jewish community to be as inconspicuous as possible. Now, whatever success and failures they have, the whole enterprise, the whole aims of the American Jewish Committee, what it tells us is, until a certain point, this point of view was possible. But really, once American Jewry became much larger, once it grew more quickly than American society grew, once it became conspicuous, especially in large cities, especially New York, the approach of the American Jewish Committee was becoming out of sync with the larger political aims and interests of American Jews in two respects. First of all, American Jewry itself was becoming more diverse. They were bringing new ideas with them. Many Jews who came from Europe, already in Europe, they had embraced very different political outlooks. Most Jews, or at least a significant number of Jews who came from Eastern Europe, were not politically conservative. Many of them were politically radicalized before they arrived, and they were radicalized when they got here. So their political interests and demands would move in a different direction. But the real challenge for the American Jewish Committee was not the growing political diversity of American Jewry, it was the growing political diversity of American society. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we have the emergence of a new movement in American politics known as progressivism. And progressivism was very attractive to a lot of people, and it was very attractive to a lot of American Jews, both immigrant and native born. It would move American Jewry in a different direction in its politics, which we'll turn to next week. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes. I'll repeat the question. Yes. Yes. The question was about nativism. Yes, the anti-immigrant xenophobia that I'm mentioning is part of this larger nativism, where you have Americans being afraid that what it means to be American, which was more fragile then than it is now, was being redefined by the arrival of a lot of people who looked and spoke and very, very different. It didn't just include really, in terms of watering down American identity, the real fear was Catholics. There were a lot of Catholics coming from Central America, from Italy. Poland was largely Catholic, but the way this discomfort was expressed was often in terms of Jews. Jews were seen as the most different. They were the only immigrants coming at the time who were not Christian of some kind. So yes, for American Protestants, all these Catholics arriving was disturbing, but at least they're Christian. All these Jews are coming, and these weren't just Jews. These were the Jews with the long black coats who are really Jewish, not the Jews we have here. They really stand out. That wasn't the main source of the change, but it was the main cause of alarm. Disproportionately, I would say, to the numbers. Yeah, definitely. The question was, Why aren't you during World War II about the American Jewish response? Now that's something we're not going to deal with. How American Jewry dealt with the plight of American Jews. The short version of the story is that until the end, during the First World War, American Jews had considerable diplomatic leverage, partly because it wasn't clear which side the United States was going to enter. So and there was this notion that the best way to win the support of the American government is to win the support of American Jews. It wasn't true, but it was a stereotype. It was an impression. And so we had both the Allies and the Axis reaching out to American Jews, try to win the support of American Jews in order to win the support of the American government. During World War II, there was no such uncertainty as to where the United States was going to enter, and so American Jews had significantly less diplomatic leverage. Well, the hesitation was really not so much should we do something, it was more about what can we do. And again, we'll talk about it in a future lecture. What it came down to is they kept going to the government to say do something, and the answer they were given again and again is the best way to help the Jews is to win war. We'll come back to that. That's a much larger question. Yeah.
Part of this immigration, anti-immigration, and anti-Christian.
Well, the question is, was the Chinese Exclusion Act part of the same xenophobia? Absolutely. The exclusion of immigrants was the exclusion of all people who were defined as different. And it wasn't just a question of being different. Some immigrants were seen as assimilatable. Some immigrants were seen as being basically just insurmountably different. That included Chinese, people of color. If you were seen as insurmountably different, you were seen as unwelcome. Yes, it's the same mentality. It peaked, in the 1920s. What was the anti-Jewish law? Johnson-Reed Act wasn't specifically an anti-Jewish law. It does not have the word Jewish in it, but passed in 1924. Basically, it established 1890 as a baseline, and it said that and placed a quota on immigration from all countries. It said that the number of people allowed from each country on an annual basis would be a percentage of the number of people from that country who were in the United States by 1890. Number of Jews from Russia, number of people from Russia by 1890 was very small. So this was a way of excluding Eastern European people, Jews, while not excluding the more desirable Western and Northern. It doesn't have the word Jews in it, but it was designed in a way that quota system, the geographically defined quota system, was defined and designed in a way specifically to target Jews. And that's who it affected the most. By the way, you can read the whole thing online. It's Johnson-Reed Act. Yes.
I always kind of thought that when blacks could start voting after the Civil War, they were heavily Republican. They changed over the years with Franklin Roosevelt and then John Kennedy, and Johnson. Now they're 90% plus Democrats.
Yes.
Do Jewish voters have a historically different trajectory?
The question was, what was the voting patterns of African Americans, which started off a Republican, then became Democrat. Jews have a similar sort of shift in their. Not only is it they have a shift, they have the same shift. Jews voted overwhelmingly Republican until really about 1920, when maybe even a little earlier. Teddy Roosevelt was reluctant about helping Russian Jews, and it was really Republicans like Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge who pushed the anti-immigration bill. And because many of the Jews by this point had come from Eastern Europe, they were more sympathetic to progressivism, which was embraced by the Democratic Party. So yes, there was a shift of Jews from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party after the First World War. Partly because of the politics of these parties, but also because of who the Jews themselves were. You had more Jews who were part of the working class there were more Jews working in sweatshops than shopkeepers, let's say. And so Jews, as we'll see, one of the things we'll see next time, Jews were instrumental, were very much part of the labor movement. Unions, Republicans were anti-union. Immigrants embraced it. So it worked in that direction. But yes, there was that kind of shift. One of the things we can say consistently about Jews is they are going to follow some larger pattern of American politics. I don't think there's a single example where the political behavior of Jews is going to be anomalous with respect to the political behavior of Americans. So you can find a pattern somewhere, which makes sense. A small minority tends to move in the direction of some larger minority or the majority. Other than that, are there any other questions? Yeah, we'll take one more question. Then clap as much as you want.
Wasn't that designed to be very anti-Catholic?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. It wasn't. It was. I would say its primary aim was Jewish immigration. But yes, the fact that the large immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, the people who weren't here in great numbers in 1890, were not only Jews, but also Catholics from Italy, Catholics from Poland, Catholics from other parts of it. So yes, it was certainly designed to be anti-Catholic as well. In fact, part of this, the anti-immigrant xenophobia, the Ku Klux Klan, in addition to targeting African Americans, where they weren't African Americans, they would go after Catholics. That was yes. Catholics were really taking it on the chops as well. Right, a minuscule quota.
Although Hilton mentioned this is very good thing, such as starting the environmental protection agency, he wasn't the first person to suggest you that have healthcare. The first president to suggest that was Harry Truman.
Yes, but Nixon was the first to really try to bring it to fruition. Yes, important. Harry Truman. Yes, I didn't mean to rob Harry Truman of one of his best ideas. But yes, but Nixon was the one who really made it a public issue. If he had the support of Congress, he would have passed it, and we wouldn't have to yell about it right now. So, there are no other questions. We'll continue next week. Thank you.